Good morning. As we enter the final weeks of the legislative session, it is absolutely essential that significant police reform and accountability legislation is passed by the House and the Senate and sent to Governor Walz's desk for his signature. The Minnesota House of Representatives passed significant reform last week in our public safety and judiciary budget. It included accountability measures and criminal justice reforms. Our bill contains provisions to prevent unnecessary traffic stops, provide civilian oversight councils and an early intervention system, restrict the use of no-knock warrants, strengthen body camera policies, and prohibit law enforcement from affiliating with white supremacist groups, among other reforms. I'm grateful to Chair Carlos Mariani, Vice Chair Cedric Frazier, Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jamie Becker-Finn, and Vice Chair Kelly Moeller, and all of the members of the DFL caucus who worked on reform legislation. I'm also incredibly grateful and indebted to Commissioner John Harrington, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Rena Moran, who with others worked for more than a year on an effort to put together a handbook of policies that we could adopt that would reduce deadly force encounters between police and communities of color. When Philando Castile lost his life in 2016, it was a catalyst for change for many DFL elected officials, appointed officials, and members of our community. Philando Castile's mother, Valerie, dedicated her life to police reform and accountability, and his best friend, John Thompson, did as well. They have been acting since Philando's death to urge us to adopt provisions that would change Minnesota's reality here. Had we listened to their recommendations, had we enacted the change that they advocated for, perhaps we would not be talking about the loss of George Floyd's life and the loss of Daunte Wright's life. We appreciate the law enforcement professionals in the state of Minnesota who keep us safe and respect human and constitutional rights. It must be acknowledged that there are heroic law enforcement officers who go to work every day putting their lives on the line to protect us. Their good and heroic work is overshadowed by these deadly force encounters that never should have happened. For all of our safety, we have to take steps to improve accountability and public trust. We in the Minnesota House DFL, in the Minnesota House of Representatives, are committed to delivering safe communities and a fair justice system for all Minnesotans. We need Senate Republicans to join with us. At the conference committee, we have set the table. We have invited them. They must accept our offer to partner in this work. Democrats and Republicans worked with community and law enforcement last summer to take some steps forward, and we all acknowledged that was chapter 1, and chapter 2 was yet to be written. The Post Board took some incredibly good steps last week, but that's just the beginning as well. Minnesotans are calling for action now, and the Minnesota House of Representatives stands with them. We hear them, and we are determined to enact meaningful police reform and accountability provisions this year. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our chair of our Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee, Carlos Mariani.
My name is Carlos Mariani Rosa, State Representative from St. Paul, and I've had the privilege for the past 3 years of chairing the Minnesota House Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform. And I have to say right off the bat that when I accepted that assignment, it was very much under the commitment on the part of our speaker, myself, and our caucus to address the racial equity challenges and racism challenges that we see in our corrections and our public safety systems. There is a wise saying, it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. Today I join our governor and my House and Senate colleagues, including my Republican colleague, Representative Miller, in saying now is the time for the Minnesota legislature to act on police reform and accountability. Not later, but now. Now, after a jury of 12 regular citizens, white and black, women and men, found that a state licensed peace officer, Sergeant Chauvin, murdered a citizen of our state in the course of a police detention, an unarmed black man named George Floyd. Not later, but now, after another state licensed peace officer shot and killed another young black man. He was 20 years old. After a traffic stop for a misdemeanor administrative suspected violation. Expired tabs leads to the death of Duante Wright. Why is that acceptable? Not later, but now, a few years after a low-level possible traffic violation also produced the outcome of a state-licensed peace officer shooting to death a non-resisting compliant Philando Castillo in front of his partner and preschool child. Now is the time, not later. This year, the Minnesota House has passed anti-bad cop legislation. We did that in our Public Safety Omnibus Bill, which will now be conferred with the Minnesota Senate. Our bill has several provisions to address these violations of decency and human rights. Now, it is a simple fact, as Senator Kent just shared, that the Minnesota Senate, on the other hand, has not passed a single piece of legislation nor held a single hearing on police accountability for these killings. They even recently reneged on their own last-minute promise to Minnesotans to hold an informational issue on policing issues. Across the nation, state legislatures are holding hearings and acting, but not the Minnesota Senate Republican majority. However, this morning we're not here to shame the senators, only to speak truth and pull one another along to meet the needs of our citizens, especially those of communities of color traumatized by deadly encounters, repeated deadly encounters with our licensed peace officer. So we're here to call on our Senate colleagues to act as we meet in conference committee, and act now. The House offers several ways to act, from regulating traffic stops to empowering citizens to review local police actions to appropriating funds for community-based interventions to violence. There is a lot that the House brings to the conference committee from which to choose, including bipartisan support for a number of these provisions. As I mentioned earlier, the officers who killed these 3 black citizens and others over the years were all licensed by the state of Minnesota. You can't be a peace officer in Minnesota unless the state licenses you. Minnesotans should be shocked that over its decades-long history, a state professional licensing board has rarely acted to use its regulatory powers to help pick out the quote-unquote bad apples and ensure that licensed professionals not act in unprofessional ways and in life-threatening ways. Recent leadership at that board is welcome, but it still needs direction from the legislature, and it would further help to see statutory affirmation of its need to be proactive. Regulatory reform may sound boring to many, but the rules and the accountability system matters. It matters to shape the firm duties and the behaviors of our licensed officers, especially in issues of life and death. The House bill, building on last year's work, uses the power of licensing to help save lives. The bill adds vital data collection. It regulates new conditions for traffic stops, directs new limits to no-knock warrants, addresses the unfairness of statutes of limitations to wrongful deaths, and regulates body camera access. In 2019, the Minnesota House passed regulatory reform to have our licensing board develop an early warning system, the kind that could have intervened in the trajectory of Sergeant Chauvin before he killed George Floyd. The Republican Senate majority held no hearings then on that proposal and rejected the House provision in conference. 12 months later, George Floyd was murdered. 3 months after that, under pressure from citizens, businesses, corporations, faith communities, the Minnesota Senate Republican majority finally agreed, and together we passed that same proposal, albeit in a watered-down state, but we acted. But the price for action was too high. It mattered to George Floyd's life that the Senate chose not to act earlier when it could have. Let's not repeat that. Our solemn duty as elected officials is to always do the right thing. Always. I don't think most of us think our job is to protect the quote-unquote bad apples or to protect a weak police accountability system. Now is the time to act and pass the next steps of police accountability legislation. The public wants police reform, and it wants police to be their partners. We can achieve both, but the Senate needs to act because it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. And members, now I call on my brother and my friend and good public servant, Senator Bobby Joe Champion.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. And Rep. Miller, thank you for that. You know, just this past week, we passed the public safety omnibus bill, and it took us through midnight to do that. And Representative Miller gave comments before we took that vote. And his comments really touched me. He told a story and he referenced his wife and his child. And after that, Representative Miller and I, we don't share any committees. And in this COVID time, we don't get the chance to build the relationships that we need to build. I took the moment, I stepped across the aisle and went over to talk to Rep. Miller, and we stepped outside and we talked for about 10 to 15 minutes. In that conversation, we got to talk about things that we had commonalities around. We need to have more of those conversations. So again, Rep. Miller, thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you better as we move through these conference committee negotiations. So thank you. I'm Cedric Frazier, Representative District 45A, which covers the cities of New Hope, Crystal, and the eastern part of Plymouth. First, I'll say, I think most people can agree that before we had a guilty verdict, we had a guilty system. And it is time that the GOP Senate act on this reality. As we enter negotiations, I recognize that this is a moment where all Minnesotans of conscience fear that Black Lives Mattering will become a political or partisan issue. It doesn't need to be this way. I don't want it to be this way. The activists who marched in the streets will tell you they aren't Democrats or Republicans. They are just concerned about human rights. GOP members from the House who voted out the provisions in this bill will tell you this issue doesn't have to be partisan. Police from Post and DPS who support provisions in this bill will tell you this bill doesn't have to be anti-police. It's going to be up to the Senate how they choose to value Black lives. Will they continue ignoring, dismissing, discounting our claims, our struggles, our protests, or will they find common ground? Because we already have in these bills. We have found common ground with the GOP on bills that ask police not to stop folks based on expired tabs and air freshness. We have found common ground on bills that ask courts not to issue arrest warrants for every petty infraction. We have found common ground with law enforcement on collecting data on bad officers so we can remove these bad apples, and that also give tools to local families' ability to be compensated for wrongful death. These are common sense reforms based on a notion that the state has a role to play in regulating police through its licensure by changing how we enforce laws. It's a regular but radical notion that our state license should mean something, like it does for our teachers. In short, if the Senate thinks Black Lives Matter, like they say, this negotiation shouldn't be hard, which returns me to how I began. I fear that this moment may lead to Black lives becoming a political, partisan issue. I hope the Senate doesn't treat our lives like a bargaining chip. And I truly mean that. And I hope they're listening right now. But I am looking forward to engaging in these negotiations, and I am looking forward to coming together truly as one Minnesota and putting some laws in place that will make and provide for a public safety system that is good for all Minnesotans.